It's 2019, but it feels like 1933.
Welcome back to part 2 of the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arneson and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. You know the drill. We're recording on Wednesday morning. If it is the fourth Thursday of the month, it must be race class. We're up to episode 16. BU Law Professor Jonathan Feingold and his guest, University of Tennessee Professor of Sociology, Dr. Deadric Williams, is joining us. We're going to be talking about, can we talk about racism without reproducing racism? I just want everyone to remember that we have been teaching this class once a month for over a year. And it is about approaching race and racism from a place of curiosity and history, rather than fear and anxiety. And as Jonathan has said so many times, we know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means. So that is my opening salvo. And Jonathan, I'm always grateful to have you back. And as I was saying to both Dr. Williams and you before we began the show, is that we've been doing this for over a year. And it has made me so aware and so sensitive to facts and conversations and essays I've read. It's not that I wasn't someone who was concerned about equity and justice and was aware of the injustice as a result of systemic racism, but I didn't see things the same way until after this last year. So I'm just going to thank you for sort of shedding so much insight and knowledge on me. And what I'm hoping is my audience has been listening for the last year, that has actually occurred to them, because it's made me, I think, a better advocate. And it's also made me more sensitive to sort of the challenges we face. So that's my thank you and my love note to you, Jonathan Feingold. So I truly appreciate it. But let's sort of go back and sort of explain to everyone where we've been and why we're at this point.
Great. Thanks, Arnie. As always, I'm so glad to be with you. And it's just such an honor to have Professor Williams with us today to help us think through a question that I honestly always struggle with so much. And so I'm just eager to get into the conversation. But let me set the stage a little bit. As Arnie said, part of the impetus for race class is the basic insight that if we want to overcome this thing that we call racism, we just need better tools to do it. And that includes how we think about it, how we understand it, how we analyze it, just the concepts and frameworks that we have. I am reminded of this movie, I think it's called The Martian, maybe. Matt Damon gets like trapped on Mars or something. And I'm pretty sure he says that he has to science the SHIT out of it. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on air. And so
That's fine. You can say it. Go on.
Like that, when it comes to racism, we have to smart the SHIT like about it. And generally, we don't treat race and racism as deeply complex analytical endeavors. And they are, in addition to just being, moral concerns. And so one of the things that we try to do here in race class is just to better understand what it is when we ask basic questions like, what is race? What is racism? Where is racism? How does racism? How do race and racism matter? And one of the key insights that we often turn back to is just the basic recognition that race is socially constructed, which you can, understand in different ways. But at a minimum, it means that the categories, Black or white, Asian, the meanings we associate with those categories, good, bad, high achiever, low achiever, and the rules for determining who gets in which category. Is it skin tone? Is it accent? Is it where your grandparents grew up? Those are all of the rules, all the categories, all the meanings we created as a society. They don't just inherently exist. They don't pre-exist the culture in which we live. And we're constantly, essentially, sort of recreating them. Now, we also know that just because race is a social construct doesn't mean it's not real. It's real in all sorts of ways, how it affects our individual lives, our collective interactions, and so much more. But so this is the thing. This is where I struggle. I feel like so often the words that we use when we talk about race or racism betray this basic and super important insight that race is socially constructed. And so before I jump into some questions with Dr. Williams, let me just offer 2 sentences, which I think are saying pretty much the same thing, but are in many ways very different. So here's the first. White students are often overrepresented on elite college campuses. In a way, generally sort of accurate description, but I hate that sentence. My property law students, we've been doing these Harry Potter analogies recently because words matter so much in the areas of law that we're studying. And words matter here because the phrasing white students implicitly, at a minimum, communicates that there's some natural category white. What if we actually rephrase that sentence as students racialized as white are often overrepresented on elite college campuses? I think that tweak is really important because it's much more consistent with this insight that race is a social construction. But it can feel clunky, it can be alienating, it might be distracting. And those are all things that often get in the way of just having important conversations about race and racism. So I'm not sure what to do.
If you said that, students that are racialized as white, okay, people would be going, what the hell does he mean? I mean, I will be honest with you, I would have no idea what you mean as racialized as white, because that's a term of art I've never heard. I don't have the history you have. So you're not only using a clunky word, but you're using a word that I can't even relate to because I don't even understand, like, where did you pull it from? And that's part of the problem. Maybe it is more accurate if you have that historical context, but if you don't, you're looking at you, it's kind of like, well, what do you mean by racialized? And I think that's part of the problem. It's helpful, but it's not.
There were a number of questions that I was going to, I'll just put two so what questions on the table, and you can feel free to jump in however you want. So the first so what is, why does it matter that we recognize that race is socially constructed? So the first so what, take that if you want. Why does this insight that race is socially constructed matter? And then the second so what, why do the words that we use matter? Why not just go the easy route and say white students? And so I'll put those on the table, then we'll get the conversation going from there.
All right, so let me introduce Dr. Williams. He's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He received his PhD in 2014 from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, in sociology. His research lies in the intersection of racism, families, and inequality. His current work not only critiques conventional approaches on racial inequality in family life, but also offers a path forward by applying critical race theory to family research. His work has not only been published in numerous peer-reviewed academic journals, but also in public outlets such as The Nation and The Conversation. Recently, he was selected as a William T. Grant Scholar. The grant supports career development for promising early career researchers. His research has also been funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And I'm so glad that you take CRT and you put it into family research, because in the end, that's where everything begins. It begins with the family and then moves up the food chain. So in a lot of ways, where you start is so important. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the questions. I appreciate the invitation actually to come on the show. So I feel like I don't know whether to break dance or or whatever, but I appreciate it. I can't do that well now, but I appreciate the invitation. So do you want me to jump in, Jonathan, to the question?
Yeah, so just jump into, or take it a different direction if you think there's a better question to ask. But yeah, so let me just go straight to it. Why do the words we use matter? Arnie, I think, is right descriptively that a lot of people react weirdly to, or, find the racialized as, but I do think it's so key. And so why do the words we use matter? Let me just start there.
Well, I think, so how I think of racism has two attributes, right? There's an ideological dimension to racism, kind of how people think about humans, and if humans can be separated based on this thing called race, phenotypical features, yada, yada, yada. But there's also a structural component to racism. That is our laws, our policies, our social practices, even our discourse and language. So part of the structuring of racism has to use a common language that people can agree on to reinforce the idea that humans can be hierarchically ordered, or assumed people can be hierarchically ordered. So language become important because it's a structuring component of racism. So we know that when we say race, right? And so let's go back to your example about white students, right? And so the idea of white students are overrepresented in elite schools. On face value, the sentence reads as if there is some inherent biological group called white. that's where language becomes important, because if we keep saying that, even though we say in the background that race is socially constructed, how we actively use it runs the risk of reproducing a kind of biological interpretation. So what I've been doing over the last few years is thinking about how to flip that on its head so that we can be careful about race and be explicit that race is a social construction. So I start saying, and I agree it's overwhelmingly clunky, but I start saying that people racialized as white, right? So people of European descent, right? There's ideologies and structures that made them white people, right? And so if we focus on the category, we get it wrong. But when we focus on the process, then we can move in a direction to help all of us understand that different racial groups don't just fall out of the heavens like metaphorical manna, right? But rather it's created to serve a particular purpose. So if people are racialized as white, then what does that mean? That means that there have been ideas about humans, right? That there is a superior group and inferior group. And then you create laws, policies, social practices, discourse, and language to kind of standardize those categories as if they are real. So to step back for a second, we ask the question then, what are the processes and mechanisms that make the categories race possible to begin with, right? And so instead of saying race as an outcome, as a given, I should say, instead of looking at race as a given, we look at race as a process, right? Racism, that is, as a process that makes the ideal of race possible. And so let me step back to unpack that a bit. The common assumption is that racial groups exist and that leads to people being racist against other groups, right? So racial groups are just demographic categories that we're all in these particular quote unquote racial groups. And then if people act a certain way against other people, that is then racism. Well, for me as a scholar of racism, I would like to switch that directionality to say that racism exists and made the ideal of race possible. So we don't have racial groups without the racism, ideologies, and structures that make race possible. So when we say white people or Black people, that becomes racism standardized.
So let me ask you a question, Dr. Williams. So what I'm almost hearing, this I'm going to mirror back, is that racism is a vehicle for superiority. And then you look for terms of art to support that racism. So it's not that race is the issue, it is racism. And then you use race as sort of a foundational tool to support your racism. But
That's
racism, right. So racism comes first. And
That's
then you're
right.
going, okay, how do I get superior? So as I'm listening to you, you know what's going through my head? Old Europe. Old Europe. If you didn't say white students, but said old European students, that's really in some ways what you're talking about. Oh, they're from the British Isles. They're from whatever. So it's in a geographic way, I would be describing it, not in a race way, but that's really one of the foundational tools because again, racism is what you have. And then you use the term race as a way of supporting that racism.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I often teach students that inequality is a pre-existing condition that makes race salient, right? So the US is grappling with its own independence, freedom, justice, etc., but simultaneously have enslaved persons. So you have to grapple with, okay, how can we be free on the one hand, but have certain groups of people enslaved persons? Well, you create a language to justify the pre-existing conditions. It's not that we're doing something wrong to quote unquote these people, but rather they're not really people, right? They're non-human. So if we can justify that in a kind of non-human way, then we can standardize enslaved persons, chattel slavery in particular, as if it's justified, right? Again, inequality serves as a pre-existing condition. Slavery been around for forever, right? But the idea that you can justify slavery by saying, well, it is a race of people that are non-human, you can then justify it, right? And so the best way I've been able to do this both in my writing and my teaching is to help students to understand that it is a process that makes the categories race possible.
So let me offer an analogy and just ask you whether this is a helpful analogy to sort of think about the conversation we're having between white people, quote unquote, and people racialized as white, quote unquote. So there's been, I think, a long conversation about thinking about people who suffer from addictions and whether or not you're going to refer to someone as an addict or someone who has an addiction or is suffering from an addiction. And the concern with calling someone an addict is there's sort of this essentializing sort of feature of the language that reduces someone to something that they're experiencing. And I say that in part because I think a lot of people sort of appreciate the benefit to altering language there, but this might be the first time they're encountering the conversation and questions about race. So I'm just wondering, is that do you see that as a sort of a comparable analogy, or is there something even different about what we're talking about here with respect to the language, with respect to race? Or I'm just trying to figure out ways to help people see what we're trying to do right here.
I think there is, I get what you're saying, but I think it's a bit deeper than that though.
Okay.
Like, so to say someone is white or black, just for the sake of the example and the time we have, in many ways, it gives meaning to that person's body, right?
Okay.
And so your analogy with the addict, it's like there's something inherently about that person. But what we don't talk about in many circles that are not focused on addiction, is the processes by which a person becomes a quote unquote addict, right? So no one just wakes up and say, hey, I'm an addict, right? Instead of understanding what is the kind of driving mechanism and driving forces that make that particular addiction possible. So with our understanding of race, we need to understand history, right? History, anthropology, legal studies, etc. Like scholars have already done this work. What's happened in many ways, in my honest opinion, is that those works get excluded from our understanding. It is, so for example, to say white people or black people is extremely convenient, right? It's straightforward, but it's also doing something that is dangerous. So if people who are racialized as black, for example, is overrepresented in poverty, when we say, well, black people are disproportionately represented in poverty, then the solution is what behavior or what things are black people doing to put themselves at risk of poverty? Now, that's one example, right? You're just saying black people. But if I say that racism makes the idea of race possible, in which there are ideologies and structures that systematically excluded people who were racialized as black from getting opportunities, both historically and contemporarily, we should expect that people racialized as black to be disproportionately represented in poverty. So it's not about people behavior, for example, but rather a set of conditions external to them that make this all possible. And so I'm trying to, again, in my own work, really address this, because I think the process is more important than the category of race itself.
So the words that I keep coming up to is like, so in a lot of ways, if you see a high proportion of people in poverty happen to be racialized as black, all right, what you're also saying is that the system and the policies have set people up to fail. And therefore, what you've done by setting them up to fail is they do fail.
That's
and
right.
It's not because
right.
they were not born failures, just
That's
the
right.
way they weren't born addicted, just the
That's
way
right.
they weren't. But if you create a whole system that basically, sets them up to fail, then guess what? You got the result you were looking for. And
That's
the
right.
result
That's right.
wasn't success. The result was poverty. The result
Right.
wasn't success. It might be, death in maternity, whatever that is. And when
That's
you
right.
look at it, it is not a function of their race. It is a function of whatever the word you want to use is. But because we've racialized these policies, what we've
right.
done is we created those results.
And to your point, yes, 100%. What has helped me to understand that is that process of racialization also reinforces the ideologies and structures, right? So if I say that people who are black are less than people who are white, historically speaking, right? And I create policies and laws that restrict access to certain privileges and resources, then when the outcome happens, then I can say, see, I can't help that these people are inherently inferior, right? I can't help the fact that these folks can't pick themselves up by their bootstraps, right? I can't help that, right? So if we often frame it as quote unquote race, then we can get away with putting the responsibility back on the people themselves who have been historically and contemporarily oppressed. Whereas if I say people racialized as, then I have to follow that with a set of historical processes that links to our contemporary understanding of reality. And so without that connection, that historical connection to the contemporary, we end up reproducing the idea that racial groups are biologically real. And I hope that made sense.
And I think that one of the key insights there is that the whole advocacy academic movement that led to the recognition that race is a social construct was in response to the broad, just sort of cultural understanding that race was biological.
Right.
And that biology, like that is like, it's powerful ideologically because it
gets you off the hook, Jonathan. If you say it's biology, then it's not your fault. You see, if it's right, go on.
No, sorry. Yeah, you're right. And it rationalizes the inequality.
That's
and
right.
so
That's right.
and then if you continue to say, so the white person or the black person, if that is the terminology, then you are seeing the group as the unit of analysis that can either pathologize or otherwise sort of reify the notion that there's something inherent to the group that is leading to the different outcomes, as opposed to the way in which societal structures, historical and otherwise, are differently situating groups as they move through life. And so we only have 3 more minutes. And so just to see if, and I wish we had 30, 40, 50,
exactly.
a long more time. But so I'm just wondering if you could also just give us an example of how, so this move from white people to racialized is white, or just the underlying logic, how it changes what academic research looks like. Like, how would a project look if it is sort of unintentionally engaging in this sort of essentializing of race, and one that is really intentionally trying to uplift the notion, the insight that race is socially constructed?
Oh, right. Great question. I'm working on that as we speak. So, and I'm gonna preface this by saying I do quantitative research, right? And so usually scholars come to the table if they want to understand racial inequality. They ask the question, what accounts for the racial gap in a given outcome, right? It could be poverty, could be maternal health, et cetera, right? And so when we ask that question, we treat racism as if it's something like external, like something out there. It has to be employment, education, marriage, or some of these variables to account for the racial gap. That's convention. And my argument is that those types of questions often unintentionally reproduce the idea that race is biologically real. What I ask is, what are the mechanisms via racism that maintains racial inequality? Because it's not like racial groups were equal and then became unequal. The making of race is indicative of the pre-existing inequality. So if I ask because racism makes the idea of race possible, when there's a racial gap in an outcome, it's always racism. The question becomes, how is racism manifesting itself in a set of variables or processes or mechanisms that makes that inequality continue over time? Because what we know is stuff like poverty, for example, is not only differences, but those differences have been maintained over time. So the questions I ask, maybe we're coming to the table, or we need to come to the table, understanding that racism as ideologies and structure are maintaining the racial gap in poverty and a host of other outcomes. Our jobs as social scientists then is to unpack and discover how is racism being manifested in stuff like state policies. Even the idea that education is the great equalizer is problematic to me, because it assumes that any particular person or group can get educated and thus inequality would disappear. Well, we know empirically that the returns to education across these racialized groups are not the same. And my argument is there's a reason for that.
How do we write
So-
this curriculum? Well, as I'm listening to you, I'm like, I want to sit down with you and say, okay, I want to start with 5-year-olds. So tell me, like, how do I start? How do I start with the language and the history and the knowledge of all these things? Because it's hard to teach adults. It just is. We're stuck. Okay. We're rooted in a system. But as I'm listening to you, it's almost like it's like a light bulb moment, but it's a light bulb that needs to be shared very young so that we can begin to sort of change our understand that the words matter and the words we're using don't make sense. That's what this is all about. I need to let you both go. Jonathan Feingold, Dr. Williams, thank you so much. We are at episode 16, I can't believe it, of Race Class. Can we talk about racism without reproducing racism? Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Williams. I really appreciate it. And as always, Jonathan Feingold, you've taught me so much and I can't wait to learn more. So thank you as well.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Ciao. This is the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen, producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.
You better think about what you're trying to do to me. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. Let's go way on, way back when. I didn't even know you couldn't have been too much more than 10.